Thank you for coming. I'm happy to talk to you about this concept of multiple reserves and salutogenesis. And I hope this is relevant to everyone. So the question is, what are our own goals in regard to aging? And how do we help patients prepare for aging? Because as many people say, aging is inevitable. Let's look into this issue. First, I want to thank Jeffrey Roberts and Shivani Nandi, who helped quite a lot with the concepts and material in this presentation. Also, I would like your feedback. I'd like to know what you think about this idea, these ideas, and where you think I should go with it, and what application it might have to your own, either your own preparation for aging, your own participation in aging, or your management of patients. I also thank Dr. Mast, who has this very valuable book published in 2001, Whole Person Dementia Assessment, who goes beyond the narrow cognitive evaluation of a patient's abilities, conceptual, perceptual, intellectual, personality, and so on, to consider other aspects of behavior and to consider it in the context of a whole person. So the story, for me, really starts with this figure from Wang. And I wrote this down as, in 1977, I found this paper by Wang, and I've been using it ever since. And it illustrates something which I find very important and not widely recognized. So we all know that impairment of brain tissue causes a decline in brain function. On the top. We know that this causes dementia. And is that the end of the story? That's the simplistic method that we are, simplistic approach that we're taught. We're taught about the brain and the enzymes and the pathways and the pathology and tangles and plaques and dendrites and neurons and acetylcholinesterase. What about physical illness, psychological reaction, and social adjustment? Perhaps the best example of that is we might commonly see an 80-year-old man who's doing very well at home, and he appears to have rapidly progressive dementia in 6 months. And it may turn, and you're wondering, why is he getting so impaired so quickly? Well, it may be that his wife died a year ago. Thank you. And is there a pointer here? Okay. It may be that his wife died a year ago, and she was doing everything for him. He had slowly progressive impairment, and the only thing that changed, and this was rapidly in onset because of a social adjustment change and depression. Similarly, we see a lot of patients who appear to have rapidly progressive dementia because they have a urinary tract infection. So I've been using this slide for almost 30 years, and I thought perhaps it could be improved because it is a bit cumbersome, and there is a role of these things in the decline of brain function themselves. It's not only a change in the presentation, but it is involved in the physiology. So the idea is that changes in function are not produced only by pathology. And we know that now from very large longitudinal studies. A lot of old people have Alzheimer pathology in the brain, and they're not demented. And if you have a large hippocampus, you're relatively protected. The association between Alzheimer pathology and dementia is poor in old people, is better in younger people. And in this paper from Cambridge, they're talking really about people over 80. So for people over 80, there's a large group of them have Alzheimer pathology, but they don't have dementia. So the function is not produced only by the pathology by itself. And then, as I said, it's widely considered that aging is inevitable. And this is illustrated very well by Alzheimer himself, because he died at the age of 51. So he didn't get to be old. So we assume aging is inevitable, but it's not, as illustrated by Alzheimer himself. So considering the fact that it's not inevitable, it doesn't happen to everybody, what are our goals for either for ourselves or for our patients? So I would say the first goal is not dying. Anybody disagree with that one? Then don't get sick. We could all agree with this. We all don't want to have cancer. We don't want to have a stroke. So this is mortality and morbidity. Everybody agrees with that. And is that it? I'm afraid that our imagination kind of stops here. And the idea which is presented in the slide with that diagram from Wang is that that's not enough. And the problem perhaps is illustrated here by the CDC, this incredibly valuable publication which you can get a free subscription to, Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Report. So is this enough? Is this what we're supposed to be concerned with in medicine? Death and sickness. So I'm adding a third category, which I call fitness, which is not exactly maybe not adequate, and if you have a better term, please let me know. But it's important to maintain as high a level of function as possible, because this enhances quality of life and enhances resistance to loss of function. And this I call salutogenesis. This comes from the Latin root salut for health. So if you have a drink with a Mexican colleague, you might say salud, to health. And pathogenesis is the origin and development of disease, and salutogenesis is the development and maintenance of health. If we are so concentrated on pathogenesis in medicine and in neurology, we might miss the concept of health in addition to disease. And the idea is that there are many older people who are obviously, they're not dead. That's goal number one. And maybe they're not sick. So they don't have cancer, they never had a stroke, they never had a heart attack. But you can imagine two 80-year-olds both being alive and not sick. One can walk 100 feet, can no longer play tennis, couldn't go to a museum because it would be too tiring for them. Maybe they're cognitively impaired in a mild way, so they're not demented, but they're not as healthy as they could be. Another one is exploring caverns in the Mammoth Cave and taking a class in Portuguese. So there are differences in health which are different than different levels of disease. So I am proposing to look at this phenomena in terms of multiple reserves. So there is enormous literature now about cognitive reserve, also called sometimes cerebral reserve, which is a very important concept which helps to explain how some people become more impaired with different levels of pathology in the brain. And I'm proposing that we should make this multiple because there are also components of physical health, psychological and social factors which interact to produce both disease and fitness. And I will present a remake of the Wang diagram, perhaps, which puts it in a clearer way. So many older people do not have illnesses, but they remain limited. So I'm saying it's not enough for the doctor to have a patient and to try to manage their care so that they don't get sick. That's not enough. You want them to have a high level of fitness. And the two things are, if you're and I don't mean fit only in terms of muscles or even cardiac, but also psychologically, physically, and socially. That makes them more resistant to disease, and it also enhances the level of function. So I did a little search here a few months ago. There are 482 papers on cognitive reserve, and nothing about the idea that the reserve should be multiple. So, as I said, the enormous emphasis on cognitive reserve, which is very important, but it's not enough. It has been called also plasticity, and it accounts for the discrepancy between someone's function and disease. It came largely from the work of Robert Katzman in the 70s, who showed also in the 80s that there's a very strong relationship between education and dementia. So people who have more than 9 years have about half the risk compared to people who have less than 9 years. Our work in Israel, in an Arab community, we found that the disease was much more common in people who had less than 2 years of education. Yaakov Stern has maybe 100 papers on this topic. Most recently, in 2013, he defined it as efficiency, capacity, compensation, maintenance, and plasticity, which are concepts of cognitive reserve. So people with more education and more cognitive reserve are more resistant. My favorite example, I can't get away from in Kentucky, is LeBron James is a great basketball player. If he had to carry a 50-pound pack on his back, he would still be very good. If I had to carry a 50-pound pack playing basketball, I wouldn't. It would be the impact on my performance would be greater. So if you have a lot of cognitive reserve, you may be more resistant to cognitive diseases. And this is undoubtedly related to genes, environment, and education. And I have proposed in papers going back to 93, 2004, and many in 2001, 2007, that it's not only education. So the value of education is not only what is learned then, but changes in intellectual lifestyle which lasts for the rest of a person's life, which includes what you do at work and what you do at home. Or to put it in another way, the brain is like every other organ in the body. It ages in regard to how it's used. And I do worry about that in the context of my practice, because many of my patients don't have much of an intellectual life, or I would say any mental life. I ask them, what do they do when they're not working? And they read the paper, which takes me about 3 minutes for the Courier Journal, and they watch television. And the hippocampus is an organ for learning, and it is important for it to be active. This is an example of a patient of mine, 88 years old. He's a French physician, highly educated, still going to conferences. He's mildly demented, and he has, I would call, moderately severe atrophy and severe ventricular enlargement I think this is Alzheimer's disease. He does not have a gait impairment, so it's not NPH. But if you look at this scan, you would think this is really quite severe atrophy. This fellow would be very impaired, but he's very highly educated and speaks 4 languages, and one would suggest he's protected by this cognitive reserve. We showed that people who are more active in recreational activities, more mentally active in social activities, have a lower risk of being in an Alzheimer group. Here, this is a lower risk of Alzheimer's disease in regard to how active they are in midlife. As an aside, this paper was published in PNAS in 2001. In this paper, this is our paper here, we had 8 authors. We had 193 Alzheimer cases, 358 controls. This work took about 12 years. And of course, it's not the only paper we published at that time, but this particular paper took us 12 years. These guys studied environmental enrichment in mice. They had 10 authors, 16 mice. Our paper has been cited 373 times. And this mouse paper has been cited 566 times. So this is just incredibly frustrating for me. Whenever you hear in the paper or newspaper, journals, Science, Nature, about environment and Alzheimer's disease and having active brain, they will cite these 16 mice. So, could talk for hours about why neuronal activity is good, and of course seizures are bad. That's another matter for another day. But we should consider it being task-specific. So of course your neurons are active if you're watching Seinfeld. But if you already know what the joke is coming, then the neurons that are active are like, well, the neurons for remembering Seinfeld jokes, which probably maybe not that important if you've already laughed at the same joke 20 times to enhance those neurons. If you're learning to pay attention, you're exercising your basal forebrain attentional system, which is innervating your cortex with cholinergic activity, which might be good for you. So it influences neurotransmitters, glucose metabolism, blood flow. It makes the brain neurons more resistant to excitotoxins, produces growth factors, and so on, and it produces new neurons. Right? This is like violation what all of us were taught in school, but learning produces new neurons. It enhances network complexity and so on. It helps us develop better strategies to deal with any impairment as it develops. So that's for cognitive reserve, which is very important. I'm not implying it's not critical, but I'm just adding this. So the physical reserve is also important, could be called systemic, and it would include stroke and all these things. And this is not everything. It's not possible to be comprehensive here because there's so many things. Every organ system could be involved. So for example, people who've had a stroke have a higher risk of Alzheimer's in part because the stroke is damaging your physical reserve, or you could say cognitive reserve, and making any particular dose of Alzheimer's disease more impairing to function, which makes sense in the context of my analogy to LeBron James. If you have one kind of impairment, another one would be more effective in making you sick or disabled. Diabetes is an important risk factor for Alzheimer's disease. Even kidney and heart diseases and polypharmacy is an enormous problem in aging. Many people have visual and hearing problems. If you can't hear, it's hard to remember. So if you have an older person with a memory problem and they're also not really understanding what's going on, they may appear to be more, and it's quite common that I have a patient who I think is significantly demented, but when I get closer and talk louder, I find out that they're perfectly okay. And the hard thing to represent here is all of these things are related. So if you have an 85-year-old patient, their kidneys, heart, lungs, eyes, ears, pancreas, and so on, they're all functioning relatively less well than they were when they were 50. And that can interact in a way which is very hard to follow. It's hard to show in a slide also. So physical inactivity, for example, in a recent study increased the risk of Alzheimer by 80%. And it can enhance executive function, particularly in this study in people who had this Alzheimer risk factor gene. Polypharmacy, or people taking too many drugs, in this paper was affected 50% of people in nursing homes. Often the drugs they're taking are called inappropriate for use in older persons. So one of the commonest things I do, which helps people, is take away this, take away that, and lower the dose of this drug, and to get from 10 drugs to 7 and hopefully then to 5. It's an enormous problem in aging and impacts their physical reserve capacity. Frailty increases the risk for dementia. And frailty, of course, is a big problem in aging, and there's a recent issue of Journal of Nutrition, Health, and Aging entirely on the subject of cognitive frailty and dementia. So I want to present the idea that there are two things here. All of these concepts of physical reserve affect the appearance of dementia if a person has disease developing. They also can affect the disease itself. An example of that is diabetes. Older people with diabetes have excess insulin unresponsiveness. Insulin is degraded by insulin-degrading enzyme, IDE, which also degrades the amyloid beta protein. And it's believed that part of the excess risk for Alzheimer associated with diabetes is because diabetics can't degrade the amyloid beta protein as well because they have too much insulin, and there's competition for insulin-degrading enzyme. In addition, diabetic patients have vascular disease, and vascular disease could contribute to dementia in another pathway. Even kidney disease has been associated with white matter pathology and as an independent risk factor for dementia. Then a recent interest of ours in the Laboratory of Neurogeriatrics is the microbiome and the metagenome. The microbiome are all the organisms in our body which can include yeast, fungi, and bacteria and viruses, which are not human cells. 80% of these are unclassifiable, and many of them have never been identified. They're mostly anaerobic, and they have maybe over 100 times more genes than our own genes, so it's called the second genome. And these bacteria have been linked to diabetes, heart disease, obesity, ankylosing spondylitis, inflammatory bowel disease, and many other things. So what could this have to do with systemic or physical reserve? It turns out that the microbes in the gut are tuning the immune system. And this beautiful phrase from Nature 2011, peripheral education of the immune system by the colonic commensal microbiota. Microbiota being all these bacteria, in this case in the colon. They tune the immune system so that if you have the right bacteria there, you are relatively anti-inflammatory. Your immune system has more regulatory lymphocytes. If you have the wrong ones, you have a more inflammatory profile, which is called Th1. And inflammation is linked to stroke, heart disease, and in Alzheimer's disease, there's inflammation in the brain associated with microgliosis. The microglia are activated, and there are interleukins and cytokines, lymphokines that are activated in the brain, and they play an important part in the neuronal degeneration. And we're doing research to see if this is linked to, if the microbiome is linked to Alzheimer and Parkinson's disease. The other relevance to physical health is that the bacteria are there and they're eating what we consume. So it's related to nutrition. If you have a high fat diet, high in saturated fat from meat, you have different bacteria than if you have a lot of fruit and vegetables with a lot of fiber. And it is relatively more inflammatory to have more meat than to have more vegetables. This is because of different classes of bacteria that are enhanced by different diets. Another paper showed that they could actually induce regulatory lymphocytes that are anti-inflammatory by rationally selecting strains of Clostridia. I'm very glad in this Nature paper they did it rationally, because irrationally selection would look really bad. It would be that paper would probably never get published. Irrationally selected mixture of Clostridia. So inflammation is linked to Alzheimer as well as Parkinson's disease, because oxidative toxicity is important in aging, and oxidative mechanisms are linked to inflammation. Okay, then here, heading to another area ahead, which is psychological reserve. So depression is a risk factor for Alzheimer's disease. Apathy, grief, sleep. Recent paper shows that in sleep, amyloid beta protein is cleared from the brain, so that it may be important how well we sleep in order to get the amyloid out of the brain. Of course, older people have unresolved conflicts and continued stress. And of course, this is psychological impact. But it's not only psychological, because if you have an impairment in function and you also have depression and psychological stress, how can you pay attention to what's happening in your life? You may appear to be demented. And I don't mean to trivialize this, but imagine a woman I have, an 80-year-old woman, I say, would you please remember these three things: shoe, balloon, and watermelon. And she says to herself, shoe, balloon, and watermelon. And she repeats them to me because she heard them. And then as I'm distracting her, her internal dialogue is, shoe, Henry died 3 years ago today, and I can't get rid of his shoes. They're still there in the closet because he loved those shoes. And I remember I bought them for his 60th birthday, and there are those shoes. And she's depressed. The word shoe reminded her of her husband who's dead. And she's not paying attention to anything I'm doing. So I ask her to, well, who's the president? Well, she doesn't know who the president is. She's thinking about her husband. So this is maybe a trivial example of how affect is related to cognitive performance. And depression can be an early feature of Alzheimer's disease. It can also enhance the dysfunction. So patients with compulsive traits would have more anxiety. It's important that everybody have compensatory and coping mechanisms to deal with changes with aging in the brain. So my favorite one is if when I come home, I always leave my keys in the same place. So I don't have to remember where I put them. So I can forget where I put them. It doesn't matter. I just leave them on something by the door. And if I don't do that, I'm likely to forget where they are. Then we get the issue of isolation, which is common in aging when older people lose a spouse. They are socially and emotionally deprived. And any human being who's severely isolated can have hallucinations, delusions. And people who are isolated, of course, if they're also old and they retire, they have loss of prestige, a loss of their meaning, their sense of meaning in life. Spirituality is a component of this psychological reserve, and of course it can help to deal with stress. In our study of Arabs in Israel, we found that women who prayed had a lower risk of mild cognitive impairment. There's a component of personality as well. A remarkable paper here on the bottom showed that emotional resilience and conscientiousness was associated with a reduced risk. Of course, you can always wonder whether this is because of the early stages of the disease or because of an impact of coping mechanisms on the disease itself, and that can be very hard or impossible to differentiate. An important approach to the issue of psychological reserve is Viktor Frankl's concept of meaning, because he says, and I agree, that the greatest task for any person is to find meaning in their life, and this can come from work, family, or endurance of suffering. And in aging, it's common our patients and people often lose this concept of meaning, and if we can help to enhance their ability to find meaning, we improve so many other things, activity and sense of self-worth, and less depression. An example of this is this patient of mine who is moderately to severely demented. However, she's very happy. She's 87, and she works, or she goes to her son's restaurant, and there she is. She's putting silverware in a napkin. She does this every day. He brings her in the afternoon, and every day she comes and she says, "Why didn't you get me earlier? I could have worked at lunch." And I asked him to take a picture of her, and I was hoping it would be one of her smiling, but actually this is a perfect picture because it shows how busy she is, right? So she's contributing to the welfare of her son's restaurant. So this is like a wonderful thing. I wish every one of our patients could have some kind of a task like that in which they participate in the world in a meaningful manner, even though to us it's a relatively trivial thing. But to her it's important. Then we get to social reserve. So this involves family resources. People who are married have a lower risk of dementia. Environmental stimulation and isolation is, of course, important. And occupational and recreational tasks over the course of a lifetime. Interesting study that illustrates this concept of social reserve is they found that women who have daughters live longer than women who have sons. And I'm not saying this applies to the current world, but this is historical data from northern Norway and Sweden. And here, published in Science, this is number of daughters and lifespan of the woman. So it's longer if there are more than 5 or 6 daughters. And it's shorter if there are more sons. And probably this is because this data is several hundred years old. So probably at this time, sons go off and fight battles and they don't pay much attention to their mother, but daughters stay home and take care of the mother. That's a generalization. Maybe it's still true. I don't know. But it illustrates the concept of social reserve. It's good to have people around to support you. Loneliness is a risk factor for cognitive impairment, and large social networks are protective. Social isolation made the memory deficit worse in mice, which shouldn't be surprising. And even Wang in 1977, he pointed this out. He said the outcome of social isolation and inactivity, regardless of their origin, is emotional deprivation, increase in the decline of physical health and self-esteem. This is an enormous problem in geriatrics and gerontology because old people who are inactive can be depressed. And depression leads to inactivity, and inactivity is depressing. So this feeds itself. So when I see a patient, I try to do whatever is possible to stop that and to get them to do something which involves activity and participation And often I say, look, do this every day for 1 month, and then tell me if you feel better. Don't expect it to work in 2 or 3 days, but if you can do this for one. Then when we're talking about the social, psychological, and physical and cognitive reserve, because I'm working in gerontology, I tend to think about older people, but it's not only about the old. Barker recently died and led to a re-examination of his hypothesis. It's called the fetal origin of disease, David Barker. And the fetal environment influences adult heart disease, obesity, and diabetes, and perhaps the brain, through several mechanisms. And these mechanisms are epigenetic. So, of course, it can't influence the genome, but it influences how the DNA is packaged in a way which influences heart disease and brain function later, in part concerning the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis and how well the stress response is modulated throughout life. Early life factors include education, head injuries, drugs, nutrition, and occupational and recreational tasks. So Carol Brain and I published a paper with the title, What Does a Pediatrician Need to Know About Alzheimer's Disease? Published in 2008. We said childhood is the period of life when lifestyle patterns are established. And it's the best time in which interventions can produce, or at least aim to produce, the best pattern of lifestyle activities. Since 2008, this paper has never been cited. I can just imagine pediatricians getting this journal and seeing the word Alzheimer and saying, well, that's obviously a paper I'm not going to read. So, to begin to conclude, it's not the same, the absence of disease is not the same as the presence of health. And this is especially true with aging. So this is a very interesting figure which shows a patient who has dementia has had changes in the brain in spinal fluid A beta and amyloid imaging going back a long time. So even maybe 10 years before the development of dementia, an Alzheimer patient already has A beta deposits in the brain and already has some atrophy developing. So here's atrophy developing before dementia. So we think that this disease develops 10 to 20 or more years before the onset of symptoms. This is so important because the origin of the disease is relatively late in life. So if you got a patient who is going to have this first onset of dementia, let's say at the age of 80, which is not uncommon, if we could move that back by 5 years, the risk she would ever get it is cut in half. Because many people who are 80 don't live to be 85. This is why it's common that older people who have the disease may not be affected, because they're on this trajectory, but they haven't reached that point yet. And then they die of something else. So this is an adaptation of the Wang figure showing this interaction, but it doesn't show the interactions here. So with the help of Jeffrey Roberts, we adapted that. And I just point out that Wang himself pointed out that since little can be done about brain tissue that has lost its functional capacity, and unfortunately this is still true, the interaction of these social, psychological, and somatic factors are the most important determinants of the course and outcome of dementia. So, if we have the Alzheimer process that's developing in the brain slowly over decades, it is eventually going to produce cognitive impairment if the person lives long enough. But the process itself can be influenced by cognitive reserve because neuronal activity favors a breakdown pattern of the amyloid precursor protein that produces less amyloid beta protein. It also produces more blood flow and more neurons, so there'd be less effectiveness of this process. Physical reserve contributes to that as well as psychological and social reserve. So these things contribute to the process itself, and they also influence the way the process causes impairment. So to look again at the LeBron James metaphor, some of these things might help to remove the weight off his back, and some of them might help him to deal with the extra weight, if that's what we're using in this metaphor for the Alzheimer process. So these reserves influence the process itself. They also influence the expression. And so these multiple reserves, they determine the reserve capacities. Lifespan, lifestyle factors influence reserve capacity, and that influences disease expression. Now, what is the elephant in the room? There are many things that could be considered for that. One of them is poverty. It's very hard to address this issue in a talk like this, but every disease is more common in people with low socioeconomic status, except gout, unless you can think of something else. But hypertension, heart disease, kidney disease, Alzheimer's disease, and it's also, of course, poverty is related to education, poverty is related to occupation, poverty is related to hypertension and smoking and drug abuse and head injury and environmental toxic and other exposures. And social isolation and probably hearing loss and visual disturbances and visual deficit in aging also. Recently, some of these issues were brought into context by an editorial in the New England Journal by Larson and colleagues from Seattle and San Francisco. He said, obviously, there are more and there will be more old people because of demographic trend that people are living longer in developed and developing countries. He also pointed out that there are declining age-specific prevalence and incidence rates of dementia. This means that there are going to be more and more cases of dementia because there are more old people. However, for any particular age, there are fewer cases. And that's because lifestyle factors have changed. And he says knowing about contributing factors is important to develop prevention strategies, because prevention is the key to better control, including epidemics of chronic disease. So you just want to say, yes, yes, yes. Prevention is the key. And the idea that there is less disease in a specific age group now than before shows that this prevention is possible because there's less hypertension, better control of heart disease and stroke, and probably more education. And this figure is in your handout from the Larson paper showing these 5 studies, for example, from Cambridge, showing that the dementia prevalence fell from 8 to 6% from about 1990 to 2009. So they did exactly the same method in 2 different times and found that for a particular age group, the risk of dementia fell. And according to Larson and colleagues, this shows the opportunity for prevention to work. Improvement in life expectancy will lead to an increase in the number of people. This justifies the value of learning more about lifestyle and risk factors. And this is how he ended the paper, the editorial. He said, given recent reports of trends in dementia incidence and prevalence, that is, trends of the incidence and prevalence falling, we believe, and hold your breath, we believe that research to uncover influences on these trends has great promise. This makes me so angry because, of course, more research is everything. You could put that on every paper ever published. You're never going to say, well, this is the end of the subject. Nobody needs to work on it anymore. What I wanted him to say was, this shows that public policy should take this into account and see what can be done to lower the incidence and prevalence of dementia. And to, I would say, enhance the multiple reserves to make people more able to deal with the problem if it develops. So my recommendations, in conclusion, first, education is linked to everything. And we're talking about education in early life, education in middle life, education in late life, education about risk factors, education about the world, and education as an opportunity for people to participate in learning. So Jeffrey showed me that the 2012 Medicare data shows the annual expenses per beneficiary was $11,000. So I would propose that Medicare pay everybody in Medicare a certain amount, and I can't say how much, several $100s. They say, okay, Mr. Jones, you have $400 this year. You have to spend, it's like food stamps, but you can't spend it on food. You can't spend it on beer. You can spend it on taking a class, going on a trip, getting a membership in the museum, or going to a gym. I think such an expenditure would be economically rewarded with lower expenses. So some examples about public policy things and these issues will be the way I conclude. So we got this 87-year-old lady. Her name was Nellie, and I saw her at an early music class in Oberlin, and she's learning to play the viola da gamba. And I asked if I could take her picture. I felt guilty because I'm taking her picture because I'm a neurologist, and I wanted to show her picture at a talk like this about this old woman who's learning a new instrument. And she said, oh, please take my picture. I want to, and send it to me. I want to show my grandchildren I'm playing in a real orchestra. And then she said, oh, I have to go. I have a class. And she put her gamba on her back. She had a special backpack. And she went running off across the campus to her next class. So this activity has cognitive component, physical component, social interaction. It's even good for her intestines to be so active. A former tennis partner of mine, he stopped playing tennis and he became the national pole vault champion. And I hope it's clear that somehow I think my point is maybe emphasized a bit better to be a little bit absurd, because I think pole vaulting is not a good idea for old people. No, this guy didn't ask me what I thought of his pole vaulting, and I forgot how high it was. It's not very high, but I think pole vaulting is not a good idea. But physical activity in walking is really good. Also, Alzheimer, you might not know that his lab was the tennis champs of South Bavaria in 1911. They were so prescient, they even used modern rackets. And another one. And I'd like the CDC to change the name of their publication to the Morbidity, Mortality, and Fitness Weekly Report. Thank you very much.
So education is correlated with reduced Alzheimer's disease. Is there any evidence that education as an intervention is helpful? I say that because people that are not educated don't like being educated. People that don't like exercise, they still don't like exercise. I ask people to exercise, they won't start. I ask people to diet, they don't. People are doing what they do because that's what they like to do. Is the intervention of education, all these things, known to be helpful?
Well, yes, I think it's impossible to get people to do something they don't want to do. So I don't want them to do crossword puzzles. If they say, should I do crossword puzzles, I want to know if they like to do. And I try to find out what each person finds rewarding or meaningful and have them do that. So this, I call this personalized medicine. So you have to learn about the interests and capacities and attributes of each person to see if there's something. If it's collecting beer cans, then that's okay. They can go study how many different kinds of German beers they can get cans on. At least that would involve some degree of learning. But you're right, you can't make them go to a class if they're not interested. Yes?
So if education and socioeconomic background are factors, is there any evidence that there is more dementia in old people in the third world countries? Because they do have, they're poor.
That's a very good question, and right. So it's my opinion, without any research, is that in some third world countries, people who are uneducated are more mentally active. Because if the life of your family depends on the crop growing, you better study the crop and the weather and the watering. I water my plants, and often they die.
Could stress be a factor?
And
a
stress.
Positive factor? There is some literature on that.
I don't know. But in general, in developing countries, there's a lower risk of dementia. It could be because of diet. They don't eat meat. So the best studies are in Ibadan, Nigeria, and they have a very low consumption of meat. At least older people, for most of their life, they didn't have hamburgers for lunch every day. And I don't know if that is responsible or not.
Since bacteria in the colon are responsible for this anti-inflammatory effect and everything else, is there a particular probiotic that you favor?
Well, probiotics contain bacteria, but apparently they're not effective in producing colonization. And there is controversy about that. Some people say they shouldn't be called probiotics, but they're not actually successful. But it may be other things in the bacteria that are helpful, and or the yogurt itself with calcium and vitamin D. So I'm not recommending not taking it. I'm not recommending going out and looking for probiotics. But I think a diet high in fiber is good, because fiber produces food for the colonic bacteria that supposedly are good for you. And fiber content is linked to heart disease and colon cancer, low fiber content. Yes?
Is there a link between autoimmune diseases and Alzheimer's disease?
Not directly. However, anti-inflammatory drugs are associated with a lower risk of getting Alzheimer's disease. But nobody should take an anti-inflammatory for that purpose. And there was a study done, and it showed that they have more ulcers if you take anti-inflammatory drugs. Yes,
so
Dr. Nauta.
the one thing that seems to help longevity, one of the few things that is really remarkably consistent through every type of animal, from paramecium to the great apes, is longevity is improved by calorie restriction. So if Alzheimer's is separate from longevity, is there also a link to calorie restriction, or how does that fit in? In other words, the degenerative changes, the redox state, there are all kinds of theories about why calorie restriction would help longevity. Does it also help Alzheimer's?
Yes. Thank you. So the question is about caloric restriction, and we and many others have published that obesity is a risk factor for dementia. And it's a risk factor for stroke. It's a more serious risk factor for heart disease. And low body weight is a risk factor for death in older people. And apparently in the past year, there are new studies from primates about caloric restriction. And one of the two major studies showed no effect. Another one showed some effect. And there are a group of neuroscientists who are practicing caloric restriction. And I know one of them, I've seen him, he looks like he has already died. But he doesn't eat on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and he never has lunch, and he eats like a bird. And he's convinced, because he's a neuroscientist, that it will help him. I'm not sure it's worth, living that long if you can't have lunch. But there's no evidence that caloric restriction would.
Well, I mean, the caloric restriction, all
brain.
things in moderation. They're talking about free-feeding weight minus, X% versus some obsessional activity.
Right.
I'm sure if you push anything to its limit or beyond reason, that you can produce a negative.
Right. Well, body weight has a U-shaped curve, so it's bad to be underweight. And I'm not uncommonly, I see older people who are. So it's a good example of physical reserve. If I have a healthy 80-year-old woman who weighs 90 pounds, I probably, depending on her height, obviously, it might be good for her to gain 10 pounds. So if she does get some problem, she'd have some weight that she can afford to lose. It's not good to be too light either. Yes, Dee.
We had an interesting journal club regarding ACE inhibitors and renin in the brain. Those that crossed into the brain were correlated with a decreased memory decline. Have you read anything about that? First I ever heard about it. It's fascinating. That renin in the brain apparently does something to hasten MMSE decline.
No, I'm not familiar with that. Nothing
I'll send
about.
you a paper.
Okay.
All right.
Right. Thank you very much for your attention.